Thank you very much first to Sophia and to Noam and to everybody as well for being here. So my name is Max Ritts. I'm a geographer at Clark University. And I'm going to be talking about a few chapters of a forthcoming book. And within that frame, just really a few moments or encounters dealing with whales, which, to paraphrase Claude Lévi-Strauss, are good animals to think sonic technologies with. Certainly that's true with the moment of AI right now and the search for interspecies language models, which have gotten a lot of attention. But it's a long history, in fact. You can go back to Cold War naval biomimicry, the hydrophone, the guitar pedal, the vocoder. All these things have a history of cetacean interaction with them. So it's a really long and fascinating history, which I don't have time to deal with, but hopefully this offers opportunity afterward. The theme I want to kind of meditate on here is really how this whale technology relationship affirms the deeply relational character of signal and noise, which are, of course, categories that seem to be proliferating in this biennale, and how, as such, those relationalities have been very productive for marine technoscience, meaning the shifting ways in which signal and noise are appraised, and appraised within specific contexts, like the one I'm going to speak about. Okay, so I'm going to situate you on the north coast. This is the north coast of British Columbia. It's a sort of rugged forested archipelago of islands close to the border of Alaska, north of Vancouver by about 600 kilometers. It's the unceded territory of many coastal First Nations, including the Gitgat First Nation, with whom I did a lot of my research. So I've been working on this coast for about 4.5 years. And this specifically is a research station called Cetacea Lab, which is on the southern tip of an island called Gill Island, where researchers are listening to whales first through analog and then digital technologies. And they're doing so for specific reasons that I'll quickly introduce. But first, I want to speak about a technological artifact that I found quite striking about my time at this station. So clipping is what happens when an audio signal is amplified past the maximum allowable limit. As an acoustical effect, clipping is typically undesired from a scientific perspective because generally scientists want good frequency response, meaning something that is measurable, which clipping compromises through the effect of overdrive. But at Cetacea Lab in 2012 and 2013, the researchers actively solicited clipping at certain times of the day. They did that so that they wouldn't miss whale detections at night, in particular when they were going to bed. The clipping sound would produce a shrill distortion, which would alert them as a kind of alarm system to the proximity of whales nearby, allowing them to go back to the station and push record, essentially. So they were getting abundance counts of these whales in and around these waters here. So Claire Turner here is sitting next to Taylor Bite, and in the waters all around her are these hydrophones, these underwater microphones that are converting pressure waves underwater into voltage, which can then be broadcast on speakers. So the whole area has been outfitted as a kind of resonant ecology. And what's happening is the station is using analog hydrophones and then switching over to digital hydrophones. And so when they switch over to digital hydrophones, beginning in around 2014, they no longer solicit clipping. They no longer solicit that sound, which was an artifact of my earlier time at the station. They do this because now they have software that can bypass the need to actually do the clipping effect. The software can automatically record signals at night that don't require human intervention. Listening is effectively delegated to algorithms and the kinds of software technologies that go with them. The gating effect noted to the top of this image here, it's just one example of the kind of operations that are normalized in these procedures. Gating effectively cuts off frequencies or focuses on certain frequencies in a way that, again, just speaks to the fact that with digitalization, you have the ability to record at more specific times and spaces than you would have had before. So you're giving more power to the kind of precision of the science, but you're losing a certain kind of relationship, which is one that I was struck by. So with the loss of clipping, a sort of meaningful marker of activity has also disappeared, an effect that had mediated a historically specific desire to encounter the whale in a specific way. And with that, I'd argue a whole region, a whole acoustical region that is the North Coast. And the argument of the book is, in a sense, that these kinds of moments, these kinds of transition moments between different sonic technologies can be used to assemble a kind of portrait, a meaningful portrait of industrial development, politics, and ecological transformation. So one way to read the book, which is a collection of different pieces that go beyond the cetacean encounter, is as a collection of sonic fragments. Distorted whale recordings, detection algorithms, noise impact assessments, propeller sounds. even guitars tuned to drop D when indigenous musicians feel the need to find new relationships with their territory. I wish I was able to talk about that chapter. That's my personal favorite, but maybe later on, if people are curious about indigenous black metal, we can talk about that stuff. So these are micrological sites from which larger forces operate and circulate, meaning the sound is a sort of picture of the antagonistic social totality that is designing and governing the development process, meaning the conversion of this region into a kind of export-oriented shipping route. So what's happening on the North Coast during my time there is you're beginning to see liquefied natural gas projects, oil and gas shipping projects, and containerized bulk cargo shipping take shape in new ways. These ports are being built out to ship, to China and California, and that's transforming the region and its ecology, and it's also raising concern for the scientists who are studying whales, among other species. And I'll get into one of the specific sounds that speaks to that question. But right now, I just want to point out that this whole time of my being on the North Coast is not only a story or a time of digitalization as a kind of social fact, meaning the 2010s, it's also a story of the pipeline decade, as it's often been called, meaning a story of massive growth of fossil fuel extractivist organization, which has, of course, been touched upon elsewhere in this Biennale, too. So what we get when we attend to details like the loss of clipping is not a unitary story of development and its effects, meaning it's not simply a story of loss or displacement or the no longer feeling full connection of humans to whales as were possible through the analog. Rather, I think that the moments of sound are so useful for capturing tensions and contradictions in these transition points, meaning transitions that involve technologies but also speak to the contradictions of the social forces that govern those technologies. So I'll just speak to a few of those with my time here. The loss of clipping can be seen, on the one hand, to speak to a kind of conjunctural politics, meaning the community of whale scientists allied with the First Nations, allied with environmentalists, were putting out digital hydrophones because they wanted a better scientific record. Right? They wanted more data so that they could prove to the government that the shipping projects that were to happen in this area would be unsafe. And so having a stronger data set was a way of intervening in the approval process. So there's a conjunctural politics to moving away from analog and into digital, which would seem to be progressive. In the same moment, however, we do find this sort of developmentalist telos that we often see with questions of digitalization, meaning you have this widening of the commodification process of digital sound. Because with digital hydrophones, it's also possible new forms of proprietary data sets, new kinds of MOUs, meaning memoranda of understanding, and a kind of growing acoustical services company, or rather a set of companies, subcontractors, like a couple that I'll talk about, who perform these increasingly minute kinds of analyses for the benefit not only of scientists, but also for shipping capitals that are trying to find ways to continue their shipping operations without disturbing whales and other marine biota. At the same time, and kind of reversing course a little bit, digitalization is not only a story of this deepening commodity logic and this developmentalist theme, it's also a story of an incredible new front of interspecies activity, meaning the AI front that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. The idea now that we're at the cusp of new kinds of language models to communicate with and from whales. So just recently, a fascinating paper was published in the journal Science involving sperm whale clicks, what are called codas, which through AI language models we've been able to decipher in new and increasingly particularistic ways, which would speak to a new form of encounter, meaning a new kind of human relationality is being achieved through digitalization, not simply the loss I had spoken of before with the loss of the analog connection. Finally, we can also see this one moment as the story of the Anthropocene, of the pluritemporal changes that are being grasped in terms of the Anthropocene. Because the whales that are in the area are not in the area with the same predictability as they had been before. There's all sorts of changes going on in the North Pacific. There's the warming of the water that is creating new sort of migratory patterns for whales. And there's been a loss of predictability among the scientists as to when whales will appear, when and why they will call, and what kinds of disturbances they carry with them when they travel from other regions. So this has produced a demand for massive amounts of data, which needs sifting through, which of course induces the question of noise and the problem of noise in the data set. And it's also relevant for another signal artifact of the coast, which is noise of a different sort, and that's ocean noise, which I'll talk to now briefly. But before I get to the question of ocean noise, I wanted to say something brief about the sort of theoretical orientations of the book. So it's kind of a combination of several different literatures, most notably sound studies, but also political ecology and critical indigenous studies. And what kind of unites them in the way I try to arrange the conversation is this theory of mediation that I work with. Raymond Williams' formalist definition of mediation is one example of how I work with questions of mediation. Because of course what I'm arguing is that industrial development is to a certain extent, and a meaningful extent, a mediation of sonic technologies, the hydrophones, the detection algorithms, even the musical instruments that I mentioned before. So mediation meaning activity which directly expresses otherwise unexpressed relations. Mediation as implying media, meaning the technological forms that transmit sonic content and come freighted with ideological and cultural meanings. Talking about mediation allows us to talk about the authorities, the moments that we are entrained to think over or pass by in pursuit of the content. So the clipping sound file, like the hiss of a record player, reminds us of the truth of mediation, to invoke Theodore Adorno. It reminds us of this fact that is there in the social that we exist within. But mediation also allows us to talk about things that are unavailable to sensuous perception, like the commodification process that has shaped the conduct and content of whale science through the digitalization I mentioned previously. So we can understand through mediation how whale science has become redefined in its approach and its appeal to certain kinds of sounds. How ideas of causal and correlational logics are being reshuffled in accordance with the kinds of data sets you have available, the kinds of claims you can make, and the kinds of listening practices that also attend whale science today. It's less direct listening, it's less about narrative, as you might get with the classic works of Katie and Roger Payne, who have developed a whole syntax of humpback whale song, and it's much more about probabilities and tracking and pattern correspondence. So this book tries to take both moments of mediation into account, meaning the technological and the political economic. It seeks to account for the different ways different kinds of mediations compose the North Coast region, and how contests over sound and sonic mediations, meaning its sound's measure, its value, its imputed effect, index broader struggles over the region. So in this, the book's theoretical charge is not actually that dissimilar from some of the trends I'm noticing in art theory, where the question of mediation has become an object of debate. And I'm thinking here of works by Anna Kornblue and Seth Kim Koum, who are, I think, concerned with the loss of mediation theory and the cultures of immediacy that seem to be prevailing in certain cases. But my work is also trying to sort of dialogue with ecological theories of mediation that come from the works of folks like Jason Moore and Julie Guthman, post-humanist theories of mediation that take other kinds of actors seriously and in ways that I don't necessarily see in those works I just mentioned. But let me get to ocean noise as another example of this sort of signal-noise relationship that involves whales and sound technologies. So ocean noise is one of the challenges that assails whale scientists in the region because of the way it assails whales. It's an effect, technically, of propeller cavitation, meaning the ships that travel through the region and are predicted to travel through the region will produce a whole bunch of noise through the effect of the cavitating propellers that move them up and down the coast. And that's because these propellers, as they move through water, generate thousands of air bubbles, which, when they collapse, make popping sounds. And the accumulation of those popping sounds creates the effect we call ocean noise, which has been in the oceans for decades, but has especially arisen in the context of shipping containerization. And I find this graph so revealing because it was produced by a scientist named Robert Frisk in 2012. It really shows you the kinds of tracking correspondences you can identify between shipping, GDP, and decibels in the ocean, right? They all track upward beginning in 1950 or so, which happens to be the period at which we begin to see the growth of the containerized shipping economy. And this is especially the case in the North Pacific, where I'm working, where the baseline of noise has risen through decibels by upwards of 10 to 12 decibels since 1965 alone. So ocean noise would seem to be a story that recommends the more traditional theory of mediation that I suggested with Adorno and Raymond Williams, but it's actually very much a story of the more assemblage-oriented theory that I would like to also foreground. Meaning it shows us the impress of different kinds of actors in the region and different kinds of agencies as they prevail over the meaning and the transmission of sound and the kinds of politics that follow. And one reason why is because the ocean is a dominant actor in how ocean noise is both transmitted and how it's being studied. Oceans accelerate sound. They make it move in different ways depending on temperature, salinity, and depth, and so play a meaningful role in how we actually assess the problem of ocean noise and its impact on whales as well. And this has produced a great deal of innovation in the acoustical services sector, as I mentioned before, including by the firm Jasco, which produced this C-Suite project, which is attempting to track whales and ocean noise in real time to allow for, again, the kind of dual movement of shipping and whales through these very delicate habitats. And that's produced, again, proprietary services that shipping capitals can, approach and purchase, for a period of time to, again, present the government with a claim that they'll be able to do the shipping without damaging the whales that, in the case of Canada, are constitutionally protected. I don't have much time to speak to this theme, but as I mentioned before, the ocean question is by no means the only question that I engage, and nor is it limited in my approach to the question of technology and sound. I worked with the Gitgat First Nation for several years working on this project, and in so doing, I became aware of my place as a settler, as a visitor to the region, which made it necessary to think carefully about how place relations enter into questions of sonic technology. We actually did a number of other projects, including we recorded the Douglas Channel shipping lane through above-ground acoustical technologies because the community was worried about the above-ground effects of shipping as well, the effects on their cultural practices, their harvesting techniques, and so forth. This isn't a study that I deal with directly in the book because it's more of a sort of citizen science project, but it informed the way I thought about my place in the region and the questions I wanted to bring to the work I did. And I think someone like the Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson has been influential for the fact that she would remind me that in using these technologies, we also have obligations, there are protocols, there are ways of thinking about the claims that they make and the claims that we should make through them that demand a certain kind of reflexivity. And again, I don't have much time to speak about it, but I'd be happy to afterward. I'll just end by saying that another moment where the signal and the noise cohere in this account is through the emergence of the smart ocean, which has been this kind of vast infrastructural approach to sort of basically outfit the entire region with sensors that would allow, again, for those perfectibilities of shipping activity and whale movement at the same time. And this has been supported by the Government of Canada with the active support of the industries that are doing the activity, the marine activity. And what this means effectively is that the region has become wired with sensors that are recording noise and signal concurrently and in different ways producing kinds of assets that allow one or the other to be prioritized. These are also very fragile assemblages. These are things that are dependent on the capacities of underwater cables to support movement and not be damaged themselves. They require constant acts of repair, such as removing the anemone from the cable network here. But they're also speaking to the new condition of governance in not only the North Coast, but worldwide in marine spaces. So the North Coast region is kind of a testing ground for what we're seeing globally with the convergence of the sustainability mandates and the demand to increase industrial production alongside the protection of animals. Meaning we're finding these increasingly nuanced frequency conditions through which we're trying to make both processes happen concurrently, shipping and marine life. And this is, I think, another front that we might want to consider as a critical artistic practice because of the ways it recalls so many of the themes that have been talked about here, from extraction to signal and noise to futurities. I have more to say, but because of the time, I will hopefully save it for the conversation afterward. Thank you. If you're interested in learning more about the book or even getting a copy, here's a discount code.
안녕하세요. 저는 이번 비엔날레의 포탈의 동굴이라는 작품을 출품한 권혜원 작가라고 합니다. 이렇게 늦은 시간까지 하루 종일 경청해 주셔서 감사합니다. 그리고 이 흥미로운 시간에 초대해 주신 노암과 니콜라와 그리고 소피아 선생님한테도 감사의 말씀을 전하겠습니다. 저는 이번 비엔날레 출품작인 포탈의 동굴을 만드는 과정에서 제가 경험하고 배운 것들에 대해서 이야기하려고 합니다. 제주의 자연적인 용암 동굴들을 만났을 때 처음 경험한 것은 시각과 카메라의 무능함이었습니다. 주로 시각적인 이미지를 통해서 공간을 다루어왔던 저로서는 이 상황이 매우 당황스러우면서도 또한 몹시 흥미로웠습니다. 지금 보시는 이 동굴의 이미지도 최소한의 인공적인 조명을 켰을 때야 포착할 수 있는 것이었습니다. 실제 완전한 암흑의 동굴은 그 어떤 카메라도 그 어떤 눈으로도 보이는 것이 없는 완전한 어둠이었습니다. 제가 어떤 카메라로도 포착할 수 없는 공간이라는 것에 당황하고 있었을 때 저와 함께 동굴을 방문했던 사운드 디자이너가 브라이언 이노의 피아노 음악을 들려주었습니다. 가져갔던 그 블루투스 스피커로 재생해준 그 음악을 동굴에서 듣는 것은 매우 이상한 경험이었습니다. 그것은 어떠한 공연장에서 듣는 것과도 달랐고 헤드폰이나 녹음 스튜디오에서 듣는 소리와도 달랐습니다. 그것은 이 동굴이 가진 고유한 잔향을 포함한 소리였습니다. 그것은 매우 말로 표현하기 힘들었는데 그 자체가 어떤 특징을 가지고 있다기보다는 다른 소리가 그 동굴의 공간적 특성으로 변형되는 듯한 느낌이었고 저는 이것을 동굴의 목소리 같다고 생각했습니다. 하지만 그 자체로는 그 특징을 파악하기 힘들고 오히려 다른 소리와 공명할 때 그리고 원래 소리의 변화에서 그 존재를 느낄 수 있었습니다. 이것이 제가 이 동굴을 음향적으로 탐사하는 것에 대한 시도를 하게 된 계기였습니다. 그래서 처음부터 제게 동굴의 음향적 탐사는 비가시성, 보이지 않음과 연관되어 있었고 이 보이지 않음을 어떻게 인식할 수 있는지 혹은 감각할 수 있는지가 제게 중요한 질문이 되었습니다. 제가 이번 작품의 디스플레이이자 혹은 작품의 대상으로 사용하고 있는 이 LED 기술은 이러한 맥락을 공유하고 있습니다. 우리의 일상에서 조명의 대부분을 대체하고 있고 이번 동굴 촬영에서도 필수 요소였던 이 LED는 그 자체가 눈에 보이지 않는 수십만 혹은 수백만 분의 1초의 전멸을 반복하는 기술입니다. 말하자면 우리 눈에 보이지 않는 수많은 어둠을 그 본질로 하고 있는 기술입니다. 하지만 인간의 눈으로 보이지 않는 어둠은 카메라를 통해서 플리커링이나 다른 에러 사항으로 드러나거나 전기 신호음의 녹음을 통해서 그 모습을 드러냅니다. 저의 프로젝트와 관련해서 또 다른 중요한 영감이 된 것은 제가 제주의 아티스트 레지던시 기간 동안 경험할 수 있었던 제주의 전통 굿이었습니다. 제주는 비교적 지역적이고 전통적인 형태의 굿이 여전히 남아있는 곳입니다. 여기서 저는 한 마을의 신방은 제주의 전통적인 무당을 가리키는 말입니다. 제주의 신방이 신에게 메시지를 전하고 싶어하는 지역민의 요청으로 3박 4일간 굿을 진행하는 것을 볼 수 있었습니다. 물론 여러 시각적인 요소도 있었지만 저는 무엇보다 이 신방이 3박 4일의 시간 동안 풀어내는 그 이야기의 형식에 빠져들었습니다. 그 이야기들은 지금 여기의 소원을 빌고 있는 사람이 있기까지의 거의 모든 것의 역사와 그 역사 속 존재들의 이름을 호명하는 것이었습니다. 제주도라는 섬이 생겨난 신화적 이야기부터 이 마을이 생겨나고 이 굿판에 앉은 사람이 어떤 조상들과 가족들로 이어져서 지금 여기에 있는지를 이야기합니다. 지금 여기가 신화와 지역사와 가족사와 개인사가 모두 교차되는 지점이라는 점을 드러내는 방식이었습니다. 그리고 또 흥미로웠던 것은 이 굿판을 진행하고 있는 신방 자신의 이야기, 무당들의 신화로부터 스승의 이야기, 그리고 자신이 무당이 된 개인사의 이야기가 이어지고 있었고 이 굿판의 역사, 그리고 신방들이 사용하는 도구의 역사들까지 포함됩니다. 3박 4일은 이 모든 것의 이름을 호명하는 데 걸리는 시간이었습니다. 저에게 이것은 매개라는 것에 대해서 다시 생각해보는 계기가 되었습니다. 신방이 인간과 신을 매개하는 것처럼 무엇을 매개한다는 것이 그 존재들 사이에 얽힌 모든 관계들을 드러내고 그 관계망 속의 이름들을 모두 호출하는 형식이라는 점에 대해서 생각하게 되었습니다. 이 매개와 비가시성을 생각하며 실제적인 작업들이 시작되었습니다. 우선 사운드 디자이너와 저는 이 동굴의 다양한 장소에서 이 동굴이 가진 고유한 잔향을 녹음했습니다. 우리는 이 소리들을 서로 중첩하면서 이 동굴이 고유하게 가지고 있는 소리를 발견하고자 했습니다. 이 소리들은 프로그램을 통해 여러 개의 리벌브를 만드는 데 사용되었습니다. 저는 사운드 디자이너의 이러한 작업을 보면서 이 리벌브라는 데이터가 시각적인 필터와는 다른 아주 흥미로운 만들기의 방식이라는 생각이 들었습니다. 보통 시각적인 필터는 그 필터 자체의 어떤 특징이 드러나거나 인식되기 마련인데, 우리가 만들어내는 리벌브는 다른 소리와 만났을 때만 그 존재를 느낄 수 있고, 또 만나는 소리마다 다른 변형이 일어나기 때문에 그 자체의 특징이나 고유성을 인식하기는 힘들었습니다. 나는 이것이 어쩌면 소리, 특히 공간의 소리에 관한 인식의 한계일 수도 있겠다고 생각이 들었습니다. 하지만 동굴의 습도에 따라, 온도에 따라 다른 반향들을 들을 수 있었고, 이것은 계절이나 날씨에 따라 달라지기도 했습니다. 동굴은 외부 공간의 온도에 매우 민감하게 변했는데, 우리가 아침에 녹음한 공간의 잔향과 저녁에 녹음한 공간의 잔향이 차이가 날 정도였습니다. 이것은 제게 온도와 습도의 변화를 소리를 통해 감각할 수 있는 가능성에 관해 생각해 볼 수 있게 해주었습니다. 우리는 다양한 조건에서의 리버브 데이터를 만들었습니다. 계절에 따라, 날씨에 따라, 온도와 습도에 따라 각기 다른 데이터였습니다. 특히 폭염이 지속되었던 이번 여름의 동굴 속의 온도와 습도는 매우 극단적인 리벌브 데이터를 우리에게 전해주었습니다. 그리고 우리가 한 것은 이 마을과 동굴 주변의 다양한 소리들을 녹음하는 일이었습니다. 지금 이 소리는 저희가 녹음한 그 동굴의 원래의 소리에 가까운 것이고, 아주 더운 저녁에 굉장히 높은 습도의 상태의 동굴에서 녹음한 사운드입니다. 잘 들리실지 어떨지 잘 모르겠지만, 그리고 이제 우리가 한 것은 이 동굴에서 녹음한 소리를 가지고 그리고 동굴 주변을 산책하면서 이 동굴을 둘러싼 환경의 소리들을 녹음했습니다. 이렇게 만들어진 사운드를 가지고 저는 이 지역의 사람들, 그 오래 사신 주민들과 함께 들으면서 대화를 나누기 시작했습니다. 이 과정에서 저희가 녹음한 사운드들은 기억을 끌어올리는 단서 같은 것이 되어주었습니다. 저는 이 기억들이 동굴의 소리들과 공명하는 기억들이라는 생각이 들었습니다. 왜냐하면 이곳의 주민들은 거의 30여 년 동안 이 동굴에 출입이 금지되어 동굴에 들어갈 수 없었고, 단지 그 동굴에 대한 기억만 가지고 있었습니다. 이 동굴이 정부의 관리하에, 그러니까 세계 자연유산센터의 관리하에 들어가면서 죄송합니다. 차지하게 된 것입니다. 제가 너무 늦게 얘기하고 있었나 보네요. 그래서 이 주민들은 거의 30년 동안 출입이 금지되어 동굴에 들어갈 수 없었고, 저희는 이 주민들과 함께 여러 이야기들을 나누었습니다. 주민들은 폐쇄되기 이전 동굴에서 더위를 피하거나 어린 시절에 놀이를 했던 기억을 떠올렸습니다. 그리고 그 기억 가운데는 제주 4.3 사건 때 학살을 피해서 동굴에서 몇 달을 보내야 하는 기억도 물론 있었습니다. 그리고 이 동굴의 전설에 대한 이야기도 해주었습니다. 그것은 이 동굴이 한 사람이 드나들 수 있는 작은 구멍이 있었고, 그 안에서 물 흐르는 소리와 빨래 방망이 소리가 계속 들렸는데, 어두운 저녁이면 빨래통 할머니가 굴에서 나와 어디론가 갔다고 합니다. 가뭄이 심하던 어느 날 마을 사람들이 이 구멍을 더 크게 뚫어보기로 해서 입구를 부수었을 때 안개 같은 구름이 솟아났지만 물소리는 더 이상 들리지 않게 되었다는 이야기였습니다. 저는 이 동굴에 관한 전설이 들리지 않는 물소리와 무너지는 동굴로 끝난다는 점이 매우 예지적이라고 생각했습니다. 왜냐하면 동굴의 붕괴는 현재 제주도에서 개발의 문제와 가장 첨예하게 부딪히고 있는 문제이기 때문입니다. 저는 제주의 동굴을 둘러싼 이런 조사들을 하면서 제주의 동굴이 여러 이슈들의 충돌로 가득한 모순된 공간이라는 것을 알게 되었습니다. 제주도는 화산 지형으로 약 300여 개가 넘는 동굴과 수백 개의 기생 화산인 오름이 있고 이를 무엇보다도 중요한 관광 자원의 일부로 생각하고 있습니다. 하지만 동시에 더 많은 관광객들이 제주를 방문할 수 있도록 제2공항을 건설하는 문제가 현실화되고 있습니다. 제2공항 예정지에는 사전 조사가 실시되는데 만약 공항 예정지 아래 동굴이 있다면 그것도 보존 가치가 높은 동굴이 있다면 그것은 그곳을 개발하는 걸림돌이 되기도 합니다. 동굴은 관광 자원으로 인식되면서도 관광 산업을 위한 개발의 위험 요소가 되기도 하는 매우 모순적인 존재로 인식되고 있습니다. 이 때문에 많은 동굴 프로젝트가 진행되고 보시는 것은 4.3 유적지로 지정된 동굴의 위치입니다. 많은 동굴 연구 프로젝트가 진행되었고 이 연구 프로젝트를 의뢰한 주체에 따라 동굴의 가치와 위험도가 각기 다르게 나오는 상황이 벌어지고 있습니다. 이러한 상황이 저희는 우리가 탐구하고 있는 성굴에서도 벌어지고 있다고 생각했습니다. 왜냐하면 성굴 위로도 도로들이 있었고 끊임없이 공사 트럭들이 지나다니고 있었기 때문입니다. 우리는 아마도 이 동굴에서 박쥐가 사라진 이유가 수없이 계속 다니는 공사 트럭의 진동 때문이 아닐까라고 같이 생각하게 되었습니다. 이러한 과정에서 저는 이 동굴을 하나의 기록 재생 장치처럼 상상하게 되었습니다. 마치 왁스로 만들어진 원통형의 사운드 기록 재생 장치였던 에디슨의 포노그래프를 떠올렸습니다. 그리고 이 동굴과 관련된 존재들의 고유한 주파수가 이 동굴에 새겨지고 그것을 또 재생할 수 있으면 어떨까 하는 상상을 하게 되었습니다. 실제로 고고학자나 동굴 생물학자와 이 동굴을 방문하면서 동굴이 얼마나 다양한 존재들의 물질적 흔적이자 지층처럼 켜켜이 새겨진 아카이브와도 같은 곳인가 하는 생각을 하게 됐습니다. 이처럼 소리에 관한 상상을 하는 것은 이 공간의 현실에 관해 더 깊고 복합적으로 접근할 수 있는 방법이라고 생각합니다. 이미 사라진 소리들, 그리고 우리가 들을 수 없는 소리들, 우리의 감각과 인식을 벗어나는 소리들에 관해 생각해 볼 수 있습니다. 그리고 우리가 동굴에서 작업을 하는 동안 만들어냈던 소리에 대해서도 생각하게 되었습니다. 카메라의 작동 소리, 촬영을 위해 켠 LED의 조명 소리, 그리고 이 작품을 광주의 전시장에서 볼 관객들의 공간에 있는 소리들도 함께 생각했습니다. 전시장의 LED가 켜지고 전멸하는 소리들, 그리고 그런 소리들은 우리가 거의 들을 수 없는 소리들이지만 존재하는 소리들입니다. 그래서 저는 마치 제주도 구판의 신방처럼 무너져가는 이 동굴의 이미지를 마주하는 시공간에 연결되어 있는 모든 것들의 소리를 여러분들 관객들이 서 있는 현장으로 불러오고자 했습니다. 스킵한 부분들이 있지만 이 정도에서 마치겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Thanks to both of you. In the interest of time, actually, we might only get to one question, but that's okay. So, yeah, Max and Hyewon, we've had a lot of conversations the past couple of days, and I think I'm continuously drawn to your generosity in your research and sort of situating the role of technologies and these mediative tools within a specific geography and making visible sort of the complexities that we're faced with every day. And I think both of your practices are really looking at that resonant ecology as a concept that Max introduced as well. So I'm really grateful for that. we, sorry, I'm just, there's only one question that we have room for, so I'm a little precious, but maybe we just get to the archive part first and then go from there, which is a lot of our conversations, we talked about the impossibility of the technologies that we're also faced with, especially as we're forming a sort of living sonic archive and the tensions between the archive and data sets as well. So I was wondering if we could meditate together on You've given examples of how those technologies are used to sort of form either data sets or archives, but what are the limitations and what are the impossibilities that we have to sort of reckon with as we use these sensor technologies and recording technologies as we think about building this resonant ecology?
Okay, thank you. I'll just say a few things. I guess, you know, the overarching theme of the book, in a way, isn't sound. It's really the environmental change of the region. This is a dramatically changing region. It's an incredibly complex bioregion, which isn't just, of course, unique to itself, but is very much a part of a global transformation going on with warming waters and new species appearing in different places. And obviously degradations and the collapse of ecosystems that have been around for centuries, or thousands of years. And so I think what's happening right now is there's this very anxious search to find signals in the noise of all the change and find ways in which to recognize the possible futures that are coming in to the region. And that has induced a great deal of anticipatory sensing and prediction and listening along with it. And so the idea of resonance is meant to sort of speak both to the historical ways in which people have looked to the region to find meaning, but also the emerging technological ways. And I think there are various ways in which the coast has become sort of positioned as an archive through which different questions about change can be asked, depending on a scientist or an indigenous teenager or a fisherman, various ways in which sound has become a tool for asking questions about how is this region changing, how will my life, what will my life look like here in 10 or 15 years? And the conclusion I come up with in the book is that, sound is an uncertain object of social mediation, meaning various questions are being asked about the region, but of course, there's so much complexity that it can't be simplified as to a singular narrative of change. In fact, the whales that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk have been rebounding. The populations of humpback whales have been doing better than they have in decades. Very unexpected result. And it doesn't go with the narrative of the developmentalist decline that you'd expect, meaning shipping is going to cancel out whales that have been dying because of other changes as well. It seems possible that there'll be humpback whales alongside these shipping projects. And so these unexpected moments are, I think, part of the way in which I try to make sense of the region as something that I'm documenting ethnographically, meaning how people come to terms with these surprises alongside what they expected things would be like in a few years. So the archive is an uncertain archive, I guess.
저는 그 맥스의 아까 이야기 중에서 그 사운드 데이터를 자동화하는 과정에서 인간을 소외시키고 있다는 그 어떤 비판이 매우 흥미롭다고 생각했는데 그것이 소피아 선생님이 방금 질문하신 어떤 아카이브에 대한 저의 고민과 연결되어 있기 때문입니다. 저는 그 동굴을 일종의 아카이브라고 생각하게 된 계기가 여러 다양한 학문의 전문가들과 동굴을 방문하면서 그런 생각이 들었는데요. 예를 들면 지질학자가 동굴에 가지는 어떤 거리감과 동물 생물학자들 혹은 동물 미생물학자들이 가지는 거리감에 대해서 생각하게 되었고 동굴이 얼마나 다양한 존재들의 어떤 흔적이 남아있는 지층과도 같은 곳인가 이런 생각을 하게 되었습니다. 저는 이것을 작업으로 그리고 전시장의 어떤 환경으로 구현하겠다고 생각을 하면서 이 다양한 스케일감을 가져오려고 굉장히 노력을 했습니다. 아까 어떻게 인간이 데이터로부터 소외되는가 하는 이야기도 물론 하셨는데요. 저는 이 존재들이 가지는 그 거리감을 최대한 구현하려고 노력했고 우리가 보통 몰입적이고 촉각적인 데이터라고 하는 방식을 사용했습니다. 그래서 예를 들면 동굴의 천장을 뚫고 자라나고 있는 나무 뿌리의 사운드의 경우는 나무 뿌리를 자라는 사운드를 만드는 것이 아니라 동굴의 물질을 파고 들어서 동굴에 비비며 자라나고 있는 그 촉각적인 사운드를 만들려고 했습니다. 그 소리의 위치는 이미지 스크린에 있는 것이 아니라 동굴의 물질 속 안에 있는 것처럼 느끼도록 만들려고 애썼습니다. 말하자면 관객들이 느끼는 소리의 위치가 굉장히 중요했죠. 그래서 그런 관객들이 결국 전시장에서 느끼게 되는 소리의 위치라던가 묘사되는 존재와의 거리감 혹은 스케일의 감각 같은 것들이 말하자면 그 맥스가 이야기한 어떤 그런 비판에 대한 예술가로서의 대안이 아니었을까 이런 대답을 해보고 싶습니다. 네.
The scale is also something that we talked about because what I found challenging and also interesting about preparing for this panel is that Max is a geographer working at very large scales to a certain degree, and Hyewon is very focused on a sort of a specific cave. I know we don't have much time, but can we just take one question from the audience? Or no? Oh, okay.
So I want to ask Max, thank you both, the three of you. It was fascinating. And I want to ask something about the whale thing, which, as you know, there was a big article about this at the New Yorker, and I wonder, and I guess it's for both of you, what do we do with this gap between, like, we can codex the language, we can create that language, right? But we don't understand anything, right? So what's up with that? Like, what's the idea of recreating that language as a structure or as syntax, but then we don't have any access to it? So I wonder, just, you know, from your two different positions, like, how do you bridge that gap, and what do you think is, you know, what does it bring to us? What does it, you know, what kind of access do we have? Because we do want to understand, right? Not like in terms of owning it, right? But then there is this opacity that is not, it's unreachable. So.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that New Yorker article, and it's funny to see all the hype that's been coming out of, you know, what seems like a pretty esoteric corner of cetology or whale science, but there you go. I mean, I think it goes back to the question that in a way was brought up at the very beginning of this panel, or of this symposium, which is, what is the social function to which these innovations are being directed, you know, with the fascinating work on quantum sensing. And in the case of whale science, I think there is this, you know, industrial question, you know, in terms of like the correspondence or the cohabitation of whales and busy shipping activity. So one of the reasons we're developing these language systems is because we want to find ways to communicate threats and risks to whales in busily shipped habitats, which is to say we want to create alerts. We want to create systems where they know not to go when shipping is going, and vice versa. And so that speaks to a kind of, you know, depressing prospect, given the potentials, the almost utopian histories of interspecies communication, all the other possibilities that might be out there, and which I'm sure are also what preoccupy many of the scientists. But the question of the sort of social effectivity, as I see it in the part of the world that I work, is around, again, you know, ensuring the reproduction of shipping and associated activity. But it's a wide world, and there are different species, and sperm whales are at the forefront of this stuff, but, you know, the humpback whales and the killer whales that I deal with would point to different ways of thinking about language as well, and potentially different kinds of relationships. So I think one of the reasons you do this work is to proliferate the possibility of different things about communication to think about. You know, not only different ways of communicating signals and concerns, but also what does it mean to communicate with one species versus another.
저도 그 맥스에게 굉장히 물어보고 싶긴 했었던 것 같습니다. AI 아까 그런 사운드 데이터가 자동화하면서 인간을 소화하는 것도 있지만 AI와 인간이 새로운 어떤 커뮤니케이션의 모델을 만들 수도 있다라고 아까 가능성에 대해서 얘기해 주셔서 방금 얘기하신 고래와 우리와의 소통이 정말 가능한 것인가 뭐 가능한 방향으로 진행되겠죠. 근데 그렇다면 노암이 얘기하신 것처럼 우리가 접근할 수 없는 데이터, 이해할 수 없는 데이터에 대해서 무엇을 해야 하는가 하는 질문이 저한테도 여전히 있는 것 같습니다. 근데 하지만 이해할 수 없는 것을 이해할 수 없는 상태로 재현하는 것은 저는 상당히 문제적이라고 생각하고 있고 그것을 이해하기 위해서 어떠한 다양한 접근이 필요한가 하는 것을 고민할 수밖에 없는 지점에 와 있다고 생각합니다. 그 중에 하나가 이런 어쩌면 선박회사에서는 쓸모없다고 생각하는 고래와 인간 사이의 대화, 저 쉬핑 컴퍼니의 배를 피해라는 이런 메시지를 줄 수 있는 이런 고래와의 대화의 언어를 개발해야 된다고 하면 그런 프로젝트에는 아티스트와 이런 지리학자와 과학자와 언어학자와 이 모두가 협업으로 그것을 조금씩 만들어갈 수 있지 않을까, 조금씩 이해해 갈 수 있지 않을까 하는 생각이 듭니다. 그래서 매우 미약하고 매우 비관적이지만 어쨌든 거대 빅테크 기업에 일괄적으로 임의되어 있는 그리고 사람들이 복잡해서 관심을 가지고 있지 않은 것에 대해서 끊임없이 얘기하고 우리 사이에 작은 어떤 모델이 될 만한 프로젝트들을 지속해서 만들어 나가는 것, 저는 그것만이 어떤 미약한 희망이 될 수 있지 않을까 이렇게 생각하고 있습니다.
Thanks for that question because it was something we actually just talked about after hearing Libby's lecture as well. So yeah, thanks everyone. We're gonna pass it on to the next performance. Thank you.